Every now and then you come across a piece of media that doesn't compare to anything you've experienced up until that moment. A profound story with the most engaging plotline, side characters as interesting as the main characters, and in the end, when it all comes together, it just doesn't wrap up things. It leaves you with a message that probably will stay with you for a very long time. That's exactly what Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood is for me. This whole take might only me be reading into things more than I should as a media student, yet watching the ending of Brotherhood, I could think of nothing but the concept of I'd see it. I know the average Westerner might not be familiar with this term, so let's directly jump with its meaning.
Fullmetal Alchemist. Fullmetal Alchemist.
Lost in translation once again. Helplessness, incapableness, weakness are only some of the English translations of the Arabic term Aids, which Adsiyet, the Turkish term, derives from. With these translations, there's no way that we can grasp what it actually means. And for the modern mind, indoctrinated by a capitalist system, we can't comprehend what Adsiyet means. It's so far away from what we value today. The capitalist system only measures our values by our usefulness and capabilities. The concept of arts completely contrasts this. Here, our value is measured by our limitations, not what we have, but what we don't have. No matter how much we progress, as long as we don't recognize our own limitations, we will always drown in our own hubris. This recognition is in the heart of Islamic spirituality, but it's also echoed across so many various traditions and philosophies globally, traced back to the greatest thinkers of them all. Once again, we have Socrates stating, "All I know is that I know nothing." Socrates' famous declaration is not his confession of his ignorance or stupidity, but his accepting, his acknowledging the boundaries of being a human being. Like in Islamic tradition, he frames wisdom as acknowledging your own shortcomings rather than looking at what you've already gained. Here, acknowledging these limitations is the actual freedom and wisdom, because through this acceptance, you act authentically, pursue knowledge sincerely, and stay away from arrogance and pretension. In thought history, there were many approaches on the concept of humility here in the West. And to sum it up, there are three main categories which most of these theories approaches fall under. The first approach, deeply rooted in Christian theology, placed humility at the very center of moral life, often framing it as self-abasement before God. The recognition of one's lowliness in light of divine majesty, sometimes tied to ideas of original sin and the denigration of the body. The second approach gained momentum particularly after the Enlightenment, rejected humility altogether, viewing it as a vice of weakness and servility that undermined self-worth. From Aristotle's preference for magnanimity to Nietzsche's critique of slave morality, humility was often cast as an obstacle to human flourishing. At last, we have the view that seeks to rehabilitate humility as a realistic self-assessment, not self-abasement, but the refusal to overestimate oneself, cultivating openness to criticism, recognition of one's limitations, and resistance to egocentric self-enhancement. Socrates' teachings, as well as the last view, is what comes closest to odds the way known to Sufi tradition. In Islamic thought, humility has nothing to do with weakness. Especially in Sufi tradition, it's a central virtue mentioned in the Quran, Hadith, and many works of various scholars. However, in all of these sources, there are two sides to humility. The first form of humility is humility towards other human beings. In this context, humility doesn't equal passivity or self-abasement. Take this saying from the scholar Yahya bin Mu'adh al-Razi as a reference: "To be proud before the one who is proud before you on account of his wealth is from humility. In this sense, humility as a worldly virtue is accepting your value with all of its lows and highs and protecting this value. The second version of humility is a bit different because this is humility before God. In front of God, one has to know that everything depends on the Creator. In Islam, you're never responsible for the outcome of your actions. You're only responsible for trying to do your best, to use everything God gifted to you the best way you can on the right path. For an example, you're a student. You're only responsible for studying. The outcome, the results of your test, of your exams, is what God gifts you. Anyway, in both cases, the key is humility of the heart, an inner state that avoids arrogance as well as self-loathing, because it shifts depending on whether it's directed to God or other human beings. Thus, humility in Islamic contemplative ethics is not bound to a fixed definition. It's very dynamic and dependent on the circumstances. The takeaway is that humility is not necessarily accepting that you're the worst and acting according to this self-image, but acknowledging you as a whole human being with weaknesses as well as strength and knowing where your limitations are. Now our question lies ahead. What makes the ending of Brotherhood ground in odds? What makes Fullmetal Alchemist a masterpiece is its consistency from start to finish. At the beginning, we have heavy themes set and follow along curiously how these premises will be resolved. Within the highly political context of military control, eugenics, genocide, and many more, the ethical quest of Alphonse and Edward Elric is in the center of everything. Once in a mentally lost state, these little boys try to bring back their dead mother with the alchemical power they possess, a forbidden, even sinful act to fulfill. So their journey begins at the top of their hubris. As little children with no guidance and experience, all they know is alchemy, science they access the world with. Their lack of knowledge makes them believe that they can achieve this act of human transmutation with the right formulas. Within the rule of equivalent exchange, the Elric brothers have to learn their lesson the hard way. Their sinful act, the transmutation, fails and their trial costs them their bodies. Alphonse loses his whole body, remaining only a soul in a suit of armor, and Edward loses one leg and an arm. The first message is bright and clear. No matter the skills or knowledge, human powers have their limitations. Accepting this truth, the journey of the brothers is just starting. On their search for what they have lost, they have many important encounters, probably the most memorable of them being with Tucker. I know, we all have been traumatized. Only saying his name gives me the chills. Anyway, a point has to be made. Tucker, aside from being the best dad in anime history, is another image of the dehumanization of someone who doesn't know his own limits. His obsession with alchemy and knowledge gets so far so that he's willing to sacrifice his own pet wife and even small child to achieve the ideal chimera, something no one has achieved in this point of the story. The series doesn't showcase this grotesque ask only for its audience as such. Even so, it's only the fourth episode. The brothers are also aware of this. Yet, they still have to learn their lesson fully. This note is especially sad when the brothers are in Lior, a town controlled by the religious authority of Father Cornello. They reveal Cornello's miracles as a scam done by the laws of alchemy. Ed and Elle achieve to disillusion the townspeople, yet Ed is still in a place where he puts himself and his craft above these people who have fallen for such a cheap trick. For him, there is still a certain truth which lies only in the knowledge of science and alchemy. The foreshadowing of the ending and the absolute message is also reflected within the homunculi, who represent the 7 deadly sins. According to the Roman Christian Church, what distinguishes pride, greed, wrath, envy, lust, gluttony, and sloth from all the other sins is that it spurs and causes all the other sins and immoral behavior. The show obviously draws a connection to Christian teachings and cites these 7 deadly sins as such. This holds a very important place in the story. However, this is only the surface of what these sins represent. Let's take a look at how Islam perceived these traits. Here, none of them are inherently sinful or evil. Very impactful and important scholars such as Al-Ghazali emphasize that impulses like desire, ambition, or even anger are only part of the human fitna, our inner nature, and are only becoming blameworthy when they are perceived in excess with evil intentions or outside of the bounds set by God. Another scholar, Ibn Qayyim, likewise argues that desire is actually morally neutral and can even lead to virtue when it's disciplined or directed toward what pleases God. This contrast highlights the theological divergence. Whereas Brotherhood introduces the deadly sins as known in Christian teachings, it rather draws connection to the Islamic perspective, where there still is room for growth and change. In this context, greed is a key figure. As the only homunculi who finds his place among the heroes, he states,
"You want to bring back someone that you've lost. You might want money. Maybe you want women. Or you might want to protect the world. These are all common things people want. Things that their hearts desire. Greed may not be good, but it's not so bad either. You humans think greed is just for money and power, but everyone wants something they don't have."
Keep in mind that greed is the reason for all evil in this show. Father, once the giraffe in the flask, causes all the control and destruction because of his greed. Among the 7 sins, it's the most present sin in this villain. Yet it's also the sin that's most humanized and justified among the homunculi. Once again, the show draws attention to the fact that the definition of good and bad lays in the limitation of anything. This message finds its absolute form in the last battle. When Ed finally stands in front of his portal, reaching the final truth, he's willing to give up his alchemy. He says, "It's true, beyond this gate lies everything about alchemy. However, I've been manipulated because of it. After having been shown the so-called truth, I was convinced that I could solve everything with alchemy, but I was wrong. That was just arrogance." And when he is asked by this abstract being whether he's willing to lower himself and become a normal person through this sacrifice, he replies, "Lower myself? I've been just a person from the start," which ends up being the right thing to do. At the end, the brothers finish their quest not by turning into greater human beings through new abilities, but by turning into their original form and accepting it with all its limitations. It was never about mastering alchemy, but knowing what it means to be a human being, which is to know that you know nothing.